Thank you to those who are joining us via the live video stream and to those who are attending here in our boardroom today on the Twin Cities campus. Our first item of discussion this morning is the committee's 2021 work plan, and I will ask Executive Director Steeves to walk us through it. So Mr. Steeves, would you please proceed?
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the committee. So we have worked in consultation with committee leadership and with the work plans that have been laid out for the policy work of the board this year to develop this work plan for your review. I'll really talk about just a couple of highlights on the kind of, there's two parts that this committee deals with, on the governance side and on the policy side. And so on the governance side of the ledger, we have teed up a conversation that will start today, which is about board required reports. And even though this has policy implications, really what this conversation is about is what kind of oversight and what kind of information the board needs to do its work. And so part of this committee's charge is to try and ensure that the board is effective in doing its work. And so one of the ways we'll be engaging in that this year, the project we'll have this year is looking at these board required reports and whether there are some ways to streamline or make those reports more effective. We'll also be doing a couple of board development discussions. There'll be one in October around adaptive governance, and then we'll have another conversation that's kind of around your development as a trustee later in the year. And then on the policy side, we'll have a couple of longer conversations. Both again kicking off today. One related to the namings policy. That policy is up for comprehensive review this year, and so we will be working through those changes as the administration consults those and brings those forward. And we'll also be looking at some housekeeping and other changes related to the chief auditor position that is currently a search underway for the next chief auditor. So those are a few highlights. It's across 5 meetings as outlined in the work plan. We do anticipate, and there are some notations at the bottom of the work plan that indicate that there are several other policies that are under comprehensive review, and should there be changes that are identified in those policies would be coming into the committee's work plan as we can fit them in as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it was our intention to make sure we provided some flexibility in the schedule in case any of those or other issues came to us as the year developed, because as the last 18 months have shown us, we never know what's coming next. But thank you very much, Mr. Steeves. So is there any discussion on the work plan before we move on? Seeing none, we'll move on to item number 2, which will be an overview of the board required report. So again, Executive Director Steeves, please take it away.
All right, Madam Chair, members of the committee. In April of 2021, the Office of Internal Audit issued a report on board required reports. This is the second time that the office has done this type of an audit. The first one was back in 2012, and the board office actually requested this. One of the things that we thought would add value is understanding across the many policies that the board has established, there are reporting requirements sprinkled throughout. And you see the work of that in your dockets every time you have a meeting. And we wanted to understand and get an audit of whether all of the reporting requirements were being complied with. And in 2012, that audit was conducted, and again now in 2021. Really, there was only one significant finding that was reported in this latest 2021 audit. There were a couple of minor issues that have already been resolved, actually, but the most significant one is the annual report from the American Indian Advisory Boards. There were some reasons why that report hasn't been submitted, and now with the latest rounds of amendments to the policy that this committee undertook, we believe that report will be forthcoming by July of 2022. So that one is kind of resolved. So largely, we start with a clean bill of health in the sense that the administration is complying with and delivering all of the required reports that this board has established. But what I think is important is then for the board to step back and say, are these reports the reports that are adding value to our governance work? Are they the ones that is the frequency the right frequency? Have some reports outlived their usefulness? As in particular, as the administration is undertaking the PEAK initiative, where it is looking at identifying opportunities across non-academic functions to increase efficiency or gain capacity, it certainly seems that even though this is not part of that initiative, that it would be beneficial for the board to engage in a similar exercise. And so this committee, one of the work plan elements that have been outlined for this committee, will engage in this kind of a review. So today, we'll just talk at a very high level about the required reports, give you an understanding of those reports and test some principles with you to get your feedback and input so that we can go back working with senior leaders and identify some recommendations to bring forward for some potential changes to these reports at a future meeting. So with that, I'll turn to some of the numbers. Right now, across all of your policies, you have 43 reports that are required to come to the board. This one that's pictured here is, by some may argue, maybe even the most important one. This is the annual accountability report. This is something that's required by the university charter, and it's akin to an annual report of a Fortune 500 company. So it reports on all sorts of things, financial metrics, enrollment metrics, other things of that nature. And so that's one of the required reports. But as we'll talk about, there are a whole range of reports. You're going to see later today an annual report from athletics, an annual report from the foundation. Both of those are required reports. You'll see things in your docket like quarterly asset management reports, semi-annual controllers reports, an annual report on space utilization. There are a whole range of reports, and in your docket is a list of all of those reports along with the citations that accompany them. In some cases, you'll see that the frequency is annual. Sometimes it's more frequent, it's semi-annual. Sometimes it's quarterly. Sometimes it's not specified. And so in a lot of cases here, I think there's an opportunity for some clarity to be established and some more crispness in terms of what it is that's most beneficial to this board. All right, let's move to the next one here. In terms of frequency, just so you get a layout of it, 30 of those 43 required reports are required on an annual basis, 5 on a semi-annual, and 3 on a quarterly basis. And this unique math that I've included in the parentheses just is to give you a sense that when you require a report semi-annually, it means that in your docket, you're seeing 10 reports. And the same with quarterly. If you're requiring 3 of those quarterly, you're seeing 12 reports in your docket. So I have long heard regents make comments about the length of dockets. And sometimes that is because there are requirements like this that are bringing pages and pages and pages of reporting data into your docket. And so the question that needs to be asked is that valuable? Is that delivering something that you find value in your oversight role, in your governance role, in establishing strategy for the university? All right, and then there are 5 other reports which are either not specified or they have a different kind of frequency. So they kind of just have a category of their own. All right, so with that, and I won't go into, because we have included this list in your docket, so I'm not going to go in and like talk about each of the 43 reports. So hopefully you'll see in there, and I think some of them you'll recognize as soon as you read them. You'll say, oh yeah, I remember that report, or I've seen that one, or that I recall that from the docket. So what I want to spend a little time on then are 3 proposed principles that would guide. And every time we talk about this, I know there's a tendency, so I start with that. I know the tendency is to never want to give up any information, like their notion, kind of the going in assumption, well, more information is always better, right? I actually argue, no, it's not. More information in your docket simply floods and buries some of the important information in lots of noise. And so I think going into this, we need to be really clear about what it is you're trying to accomplish and why. And so if we look at the first principle that's proposed, it's that reports that support and enhance governance discussions about the university's strategic direction should be retained or enhanced. And so I think it's important to be really thoughtful about what constitutes a governance level discussion, what is a strategic discussion about the university's direction versus what is basic day-to-day operational kind of information. And I think you should focus more on the strategic conversations. Where is the university going long term? What kinds of governance information do you need to best fulfill your role? And so that's principle one. And I'll go through all three and then we can talk more. The second proposed principle is that reports that serve primarily as an oversight mechanism should be delivered at a frequency that best aligns with the work and reflects the underlying risk associated with that activity. In the Audit and Compliance Committee, they've done excellent work in developing risk principles that really guide a lot of the internal audit work. And for instance, and I'm going to paraphrase here a little bit, but for instance, we've established that as a university, we're willing to take a much higher risk in pursuit of breakthrough research and discoveries, and a much lower risk in terms of compliance with federal and state laws. So in other words, we are going to do a lot more things to control to ensure that we're complying with the law. And we're going to just be a lot more willing to engage in some risk of failure when we are trying to pursue breakthrough research. And so the same, I think, goes here, that when you're thinking about some of this reporting is reporting so that there's assurance, there's oversight assurance that certain things are happening. And so first and foremost, we need to make sure that oversight is happening, that we're not requiring reports on a time frame or in a time frame that doesn't align well with the work that the administration is already doing. We should try to align the reports as best we can. And also we need to think about if there's an area where the risk is incredibly minimal, that there's something that's going to go wrong, or that the oversight is not adding tremendous value because there's already lots of mechanisms in place to ensure that the risk is low, then perhaps the report isn't the mechanism that we should be using to engage in that oversight. Perhaps the policies that are already in place are sufficient on their own without an additional reporting requirement. All right, third principle is reports with modest strategic or oversight value or that have outlived their usefulness should be eliminated. And so again, this goes back to that notion that sometimes it's hard to let go of some of those things. We engaged with this board maybe 3 or 4 years ago in an exercise around what are the approval thresholds that the board should require in terms of approving certain contracts or agreements or real estate transactions. And I do recall, I mean, it was difficult for some regions to say, well, wait, I'm not sure I want to increase that threshold and see less of those transactions. And yet, when you let go of some of those things, it opens up room for you to have conversations more along the lines of, for instance, yesterday, instead of focusing on one real estate transaction, you're focusing more on what are the principles that should guide property acquisition or disposition, and we get alignment around that and less concern around an individual transaction. So I'm echoing. Those are the principles that we propose. I'm happy to engage in conversation, questions, discussion around the required reports list, some of the statistics that we've outlined, and the principles. So wherever you'd like to take the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Steeves. As people collect their thoughts around those proposed principles and the very comprehensive list we have of our reports, I understand Regent McMillan has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Aylin. Can you hear me?
So Regent McMillan, if you're there, please feel free to ask.
Yeah, can you hear me, Chair Verheugen? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Regent McMillan.
Okay, thank you. Brian, great report, and three thoughts here. One, it would be really helpful to know where the reports line up, the ones of our 43 or whatever the total number is, line up with legislatively required reports. Just that, I think that's an important piece of information here. What's required? What have they ordered? I know it's not part of board policy, but it'd be really helpful as we engage in this really important dialogue here. Second, I couldn't agree more with Mr. Steves in terms of how do we find a way to do some streamlining here and at the same time highlight the strategic conversations we have, having had the opportunity to lead finance and operations, where some vast number of these 43 reports just get appended to the end of the docket, and then the administration doesn't have time to pull things up, and we don't have time to ask, the reports just get, I think, buried in a way, and I just don't find that very helpful.
Regent McMillan, you're breaking up a bit, but I think from that one we caught that recognition of some of
for the administration to say, hey, here's your report. I'll go back to mute. You got my point, I hope. So I'd love to.
I believe we did, but thank you so much. Regent Mayron.
Yes. Question, as I think about particularly the last principle, which is if it doesn't relate to our oversight function or governance function, then to think about eliminating it, which I would support. At the same time, there may be certain regions who are interested in the kinds of information that those reports contain that don't relate to those functions. And what I'm wondering about is, are the nature of those reports that are in fact prepared in the ordinary course of either administration or within faculty or departments, such that if regents were apprised that this report was prepared, for example, in CLA, we will not be providing it to you as part of our oversight function, but if you'd like a copy of it, it can be made available to you, so that those who want to do a deeper dive in a particular area, but it doesn't relate directly to their governance function, could at least know the report exists and could request it if they would so like it. So making them available upon request. And that I think this would also assist in perhaps regents asking for information that takes up time of staff that they're not preparing in the ordinary course, but at least for those that are prepared in the ordinary course of business, regents could have access to that if they wanted it.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, suggestions? Regent Powell, Chair Powell,
Thank
Regent
you.
Chair Powell.
Whatever. You're the chair. I guess this is a question for Mr. Steves. What would be the way forward from here? Is the idea that following a discussion of these principles, you guys would take a shot at drafting, here's what we want to keep, here's what we want to consolidate, here's what we think we should eliminate, and we can debate specifics. I mean, eventually we're going to have to go through this sort of report by report, or you'll have to, and we'll have to. So is that sort of the next step here?
Mr. Steves.
Madam Chair, Regent Powell, yes, our intent would be that it wouldn't just be us in the board office that would do this, though. We would work with each of the senior leader liaisons who are staffing board committees or serving with board committees, and so we'll work through the list with each of them and do a review to identify, using these principles, if these principles are acceptable to the group, we'll use these principles and we'll go in and we'll try to identify recommendations across this list of 43, and then we'll come back. In some cases, I expect that our recommendation won't be any change. I mean, in many cases probably, But then in other cases, we'll come back and either have a recommendation to change the frequency, or perhaps consolidate some reports, or perhaps eliminate some reports. And so then I would expect we'd come back with an omnibus package of recommendations that might touch on a dozen different policies, but would be a kind of a single package of recommendations.
Thank you.
Follow-up?
No follow-up. Thank you.
Regent Kenyanya?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Steves, for the presentation. I just wanted to make a comment that, I certainly agree that taking a look at the number is something we should be engaging in and just deciding why we have all 43 of those. While the reports, when you look at them, they might seem simple. I can appreciate the amount of time, right, effort and whatnot that goes into this, which is time that could be going into something else. I did just want to say that they're probably value, and I think this kind of goes into, Regent McMillan was asking about which reports are required by the legislature, right? So obviously those would be evaluated separately. And I think Regent Mayeron was asking about reports that would be prepared otherwise. So I think beyond this board's engagement with a certain report, there may be still a benefit to having the report, either for other members of the university, members of the public, to whatever extent they engage with those. I'm sure it's not too much, and also just for matter of record, right? It probably is helpful for some of these things to be able to track historically and go back and kind of see that change over time or reference back. So there may be some value that way, but at the same time, reports take time to put together, right? Even if it's 10 pages or whatever. And we obviously do have to consider what other use that time could be going to if it's not as necessary anymore. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And Regent Rocha?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And really following fairly closely with what Regent Kenyanya was just saying, I do agree that there are times when reports may have outlived their usefulness. We don't necessarily need a report on our buggy whip inventory anymore, but things do change. But I would say that I tend to fall on the side that we are a public institution, and maintaining access to this type of data to members of the board and to the members of the public, I think it can be important as we evaluate report by report. At one point, we used to receive the docket in paper form, and it would be the size of a medium-sized community's phone book, and now it's electronic, so it's a little bit easier, I think, to produce it economically and environmentally sound. But I just think as we go forward, that's sort of where I think I'll approach it, is that having access to that information is valuable, even if it doesn't necessarily result in a major discussion every time it's produced. The other side of it, with respect to leaving it for requests by members of the board as people who just joined the board, there's a great deal to learn here. And as a person comes into this position on Board of Regents, and if the reports aren't there, you can be fairly certain that by one generation of regents, people will forget that there ever was a report in that area, so they aren't likely to have the consciousness to make those types of requests for what can oftentimes be very helpful information in our governance role. So that's my position as we look at these various reports going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there-
Regent Powell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. One other thought or question for Mr. Steves, and that is, and it's sort of reflecting now on the comment that you're going to have a process that you'll go through with people who generate the reports. I don't want to create more work, but as we go through that exercise and we have that conversation, is this an opportunity to as well in those conversations, see if there are really any significant areas of risk exposure that we're not reporting on now. And so, I mean, I understand the purpose of this is to streamline, and I think we all get that. But again, as you go through, there may be one or two areas, particularly in this risk area, where we just really need to understand our compliance and the magnitude. There might be one or two areas that we're missing. And certainly if as part of this, as we eliminate, there are a couple that we decide to create, I mean, that's not a bad outcome either, particularly if you're going to go through this thorough process. So that's a thought.
And just to tail onto that, it may not be so much as eliminating, but providing some further guidance on what is most helpful for our purposes to direct our attention, as Mr. Steve said, to those important pieces versus them necessarily getting lost in a narrative or not being highlighted in a way that gets us the information necessary while providing that backup information necessary as well. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak or any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much, Mr. Steves. We'll move on to item number 3, the resolution related to policy amendments concerning the chief auditor review. Joining Executive Director Steves at this time is Jason Langworthy, our board associate of policy and committees. But Mr. Steves, would you please start us off?
Absolutely. Madam Chair, the process of transitioning to a new chief auditor for the first time in 27 years really prompted an evaluation of board policy related to that position. And and that evaluation was really against current practice as well as expected practice. And so we've identified from that review several provisions that we believe should be updated. And Mr. Langworthy is going to walk through those in detail. This stage is the formal review stage. And so we would take input, feedback, all of that now, and then at a subsequent meeting, you would take action on these amendments. So,
Chair Verhalen. Good morning, members of the committee. The amendments are outlined in the resolution starting on page 19 of your docket materials, and they deal primarily with 2 policies. The first is Board of Regents policy, reservation and delegation of authority. And we'll start in Article 1, Section 4, Subdivision 1, which is the board's reserved appointment authority. Here we're clarifying that the chief auditor is not included in the list of individuals recommended for appointment by the president. So we're simply adding an exception there to the list. Moving on in that policy to Article 1, Section 10. Here we're clarifying, this is the section that involves the board's reserved authority for the audit function. We're doing a few things here. We're cleaning up some inconsistencies in how we refer to the independent auditor. Then we're removing the president from directly evaluating the performance of the chief auditor, instead reserving that process to the board directly. Certainly the president would be actively involved in that process, but because this is a position that directly reports to the board, we're aligning it with how other positions, like the position of the president, is evaluated by the board. And we're ensuring that there are review procedures on file in the Office of the Board of Regents. This aligns with what we do for the presidential performance review process. Then turning to Article 2, Section 5. Article 2 of the policy are broad delegations that are made to the president or to other direct reports of the board. And in Section 5, this is the broad delegation to the secretary, treasurer, general counsel, and chief auditor. And here we're adding a section that makes clear the board's expectation that the chief auditor and the general counsel shall notify the board of any matter that significantly involves the authority of the board or poses a significant impact to the university's mission or a significant risk to the university. This certainly aligns with current practice, but this is a way for us to be clear in setting the board's expectation that the chief auditor and general counsel will follow this directive. Then finally, we'll turn to our other policy, Board of Regents policy, board operations and agenda guidelines, or known to its friends as BOAG. In BOAG, we're aligning the process for the selection, appointment, and removal of the chief auditor to other positions that report directly to the board, like the Office of the President, with that practice. So that then will sit directly with the full board. And with that, Chair Verhalen, Mr. Steves and I are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Langworthy. Anything additional, Mr. Steves? Okay. Just as a reminder, this is before us for review, so any comments Regents might have on this would be the time to do that. It will come before us again for review and action, so we're not asking for any action today. It's for review and feedback. Regent Mayron.
Yes, question. Under the proposed resolution, under Article 1, Section 4, Subdivision 1, we have what we're proposing, or the resolution proposes, is that the president would make recommendation for individuals for appointment of all of the positions itemized above except for the chief auditor. And I'm interested in hearing the rationale as to why we should carve out the chief auditor from the president's recommendations. For example, the president continues to make recommendations on the general counsel role. So I'm interested in the thinking behind that carve out.
Thank you, Regent Mayron. Mr. Steves?
Madam Chair, Regent Mayron, the general counsel and the chief auditor have different reporting lines. The general counsel has a dual report to the president and to the board, with then there being special provisions carved out in policy related to that position that are unique only to that position. For instance, it says in policy that the general counsel has an ultimate client, which is the Board of Regents. It also says that the president is not permitted to remove the general counsel without the board's approval. No other position has that. In this case, the chief auditor has a direct reporting line to the board and a dotted reporting line to the president. And it feels important to reflect that in policy, number one, and number two, to ensure that there is a line of distinction between that role and other roles that the president might bring forward and recommend to the board, because the chief auditor needs to be able to audit the entire institution, including the president. And having a president bringing forward a recommendation of a candidate, how does that candidate, or how does that new chief auditor think about their relationship with the president differently versus having the board directly appointing? And that's what this is trying to reflect.
Chair Verhalen?
Yes, of course, Mr. Langworthy.
The other thing I'll add, Regent Mayron, is that in the next subdivision, the general counsel may be removed by the president with approval of the board, but the chief auditor may not be removed by the president. So we're also aligning the appointment language then to subdivision 2 on removal, where only the board can remove the chief auditor.
Thank you. Thank you for that information. Appreciate it. I don't have any further follow-up.
Okay, thank you, Regent Mayron. Other comments or questions from the regents? Sorry, Regent Swigum.
Madam Chair, thank you. Maybe not directly related to the resolution, but an opportunity to bring you, the board, a quick update on the chief auditor search, just for very, very quickly. We have had, the chief auditor search committee has had 2 meetings at this point. We have met with the AGB board, which is basically our search group out there. We are looking at having, I think it's a September 20th date for the application deadline for persons to apply for the position of chief auditor. The committee will then go through those applications, make some recommendations to this board, probably 3, 4, 5 persons for us to interview. I think we're looking at 2 dates in November to do that as a board. So just a quick update. We will consider our committee and our board action to be successful if our new chief auditor serves for 27 years.
Thank you, Regent Swigum. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just very briefly, I've been fortunate to have the board leadership put me on the audit committee and in audit committee leadership as chair and now vice chair the last several years, and seeing the importance of this role. I just want to speak. I wasn't part of. I don't think the impetus for these proposed changes, but I think they're very good changes. And Mr. Steves' explanation a moment ago, along with Mr. Langworthy, I think clarified that this really clears up some of these reporting lines, which I think strengthens the role of the auditor, not just for the board, but also for the administration, and showing that independence. I think that's going to be it'll serve the university well with these changes, and I find them to be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. Any additional comments or questions for Mr. Steeves or Mr. Langworthy? Very good. Thank you, Mr. Langworthy. We will move, and you as well, Mr. Steeves. Our fourth item today is a conceptual overview and review of the consultation plan for the proposed amendments to the Board of Regents policy namings. So President Gable, if you would please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Vice Chair Hipsch, and members of the committee. So this morning, we will discuss next steps in the board's namings policy, which is up for comprehensive review this year. But before discussing these next steps, I'd like to briefly walk you through how we arrived to the components of that comprehensive review that we've been referring to as renamings, which are new. The history on this is long, but was most recently restarted as a result of a groundbreaking project called A Campus Divided: Progressives, Anti-Communists, Racism, and Anti-Semitism at the University of Minnesota, 1930 to 1942. And this was originally displayed at the Anderson Library in fall of 2017, and then again in fall of 2018 at the Wilson Library. It presented evidence of anti-Semitism and racial discrimination at the university, and it served as inspiration and a foundation for an MSA resolution and resulting presidential directive calling for an examination of the actions of 2 university presidents and 2 senior leaders at that time, Kaufman, Coffey, Nicholson, and Middlebrook, respectively. A task force was formed called the Task Force on Building Names and Institutional History, and they undertook this work and did historical research built upon the framework designed by a previous group called the President and Provost Advisory Committee on University History. It was comprised of faculty, staff, students, alumni, and community members, and representation from all 5 campuses. The task force was focused specifically on these 4 senior administrators, and their report opened up a conversation more broadly over the purpose of namings and how the evolution of our thinking as a community and as society as a whole should shape our namings process. So the board took up these particular namings in April 2019 and passed a resolution directing the president to do, amongst other things, recommend to the Board of Regents policy a namings policy that established clear principles and procedures to guide future renamings discussions. So when this administration began in July of 2019, we immediately undertook that work. And over the 2019-2020 academic year, the administration engaged in a lot of dialogue, consultation, and action to address the board's charge. So at the board's October 2019 Policy and Governance Committee meeting, we presented a timeline to the board for how we were going to take this through our campus community, our partners, and stakeholders. In December 2019, at the committee's follow-up meeting, we initiated the first of a 3-part framework that we presented in 2019 of presentations to establish revisions to the renamings process. We presented 4 renamings frameworks for consideration, including 3 peer examples, one from Yale, one from the University of Michigan, and one from Stanford University, as well as the work of the previous President and Provost Advisory Committee on University History that I referred to earlier. And that report has colloquially come to be known as the Coleman Committee report. So we presented those 4 to the board and talked about how those 4 could serve as examples or inspiration around guiding principles, shared governance, process, how to receive requests, etc. We took in all of that feedback, and in February 2020, at the board's Policy and Governance Committee meeting, we brought up part 2 of the renamings framework. So using the feedback that we had received from you all and from across our community, we presented a draft policy for consideration that offered 5 guiding principles, 4 of which incorporated ideas and language from the Coleman Committee report, while the other guiding principle on community and belonging came from the MPAC 2025 system-wide strategic plan. Then we presented a series of factors to decide decision-making around a renaming or the revocation of a naming. These were largely adapted from the Stanford University framework. And the draft policy also added steps and procedures around who could make a request, how the request should be submitted, and processed in a variety of other areas. In the spring of 2020, we engaged this policy in a consultative process across our system, formally and informally, which continued even amidst the interruptions presented by the pandemic in the spring of 2020. However, with respect for our community and a lot of pain and grief that we all felt after George Floyd's murder, we postponed part 3 of the renamings framework, which was slated for June 2020. The months since have inspired a lot of reflection around different stakeholders and members of our community. Several of our peers have pivoted in their approach to this question across the country, ranging from Princeton to Clemson and others that have evaluated and renamed buildings and monuments honoring historical figures with controversial and complicated pasts. And we've used this time to reevaluate and further consult what we were thinking around renamings and what we've been thinking since. So members of the committee, the premise of the revised approach that we bring to you here today is pretty simple, actually, in amidst a very complicated question. If university namings and who we honor is a representation of us, is a representation of our achievements, is a representation of our progress, then the landscape of those namings should also evolve because we will always have new achievements and new progress, and we should honor that as well. The problem is we have a fixed number of buildings. So if things are to honor our achievements and progress, then we need to be in a position to evolve and have those namings evolve as well, to represent those new achievements, new contexts. And as a result of that, we are proposing that honorary university namings should have a sunset and would endure for a set period of time, which we are proposing for initial discussion to be 100 years. The 100-year horizon we are proposing would impact honorary namings, therefore, prior to 1921, and that would continue year by year as the timeline shifts forward. To be clear, namings associated with gifts or sponsorships would not apply to this 100-year sunset because those are guided by contractual stipulations with specific gift or sponsorship agreements. As we seek to review these namings, members of the committee, it is recommended that the All University Honors Committee lead this work. This is an existing committee that already addresses many of the ways in which we honor people or attach people's names to different components of the university. Their review would consider 2 potential areas. The first is whether this honorary naming should continue once the 100-year mark is reached, and we have criteria that is evolving to assist them in this process. Is the person who was honored so extraordinary, such an exemplar of the university's past, present, and future? Do they represent the highest aspiration of institutional recognition, values, and ideals, including the university's diversity, equity, and inclusion goals? Are they a part of the permanent evolving landscape of history and achievement? On the other hand, if the committee does not recommend a naming continue after the review, then they would recommend a new name that would come initially to the president, and then the president would propose to the Board of Regents for review and action. So that is one category of how we would consider renamings, that we would have a very extended timeline, at least in our initial discussion of a century, to honor a person who has made a significant contribution, and then to recognize the fact that there may be time and a place for new honorees to receive that recognition. A second category of renamings is what we would call, for purposes of discussion, a bad actor renaming, which is a renaming or revocation that is considered for removal by virtue of discovered bad acts by the honoree. The Honors Committee would review the request for renaming guided by the principles that we presented to you last spring around community and belonging, preservation, exceptionality, deliberation, and change. If the review affirms a recommendation to the president to rename or revoke a naming, then the committee would research and propose new namings to the office of the president, which would come before the board for review and action, which allows us the broad, public, and transparent representation of the university's history and values in the process of selecting who we honor by naming them with a building, or who we recognize perhaps should no longer bear that honor. Members of the committee, we believe the Honors Committee is best positioned to do this important work. They have tremendous expertise and representation. They're a cornerstone of shared governance. And baked into this process, of course, is the very public forum of the board review and action before any ultimate decision would be made. We've already begun consulting with the Honors Committee and other related governance groups around this concept as we've initiated and restarted the renamings conversation since spring of 2020. So with this new refreshed renamings concept, the next steps would be that we would take in feedback and have the conversation today, of course, and then relying upon that feedback and consultation, we would then begin with a majority of system-wide consultation over the course of the fall, anchored heavily in next month, to build upon our extensive engagement that has preceded our conversation today. We would start again with the All University Honors Committee on October 6th and continue with more formal and informal governance groups that represent students, faculty, staff, the community, and other partners. We also plan to engage senior leaders at our annual retreat in October. This is part of our agenda. We have alumni at homecoming later this month. I'm presenting to the foundation board in October, and so on. It's a comprehensive consultative review of the broader namings policy with this renamings component included as part of the board's charge from April of 2019. So with this timeline in mind, our thought is that the best way that we would capture the spirit of shared governance, which is obviously critically important in a question like this, would be to bring the board an updated red line draft of the actual policy for review at the December meeting. That way we would be able to capture an extensive amount of consultation and conversation before the board actually dives in on the verbiage, language, and process. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Madam Chair, for feedback and questions.
Thank you, President Gable. Are there any questions or comments at this time from the regents? Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. Just a couple of thoughts for President Gable. I mean, first of all, I think, you've consulted widely with members of the board, and I think I, along with many, are really appreciative. I think I, along with many others, really appreciative of this idea. I think it's really a good idea. And just a couple of thoughts for you as you continue to refine the language, which may or may not be useful. The first one has to do with the 100-year timetable, and the thought here is that the strong expectation would be it's 100 years, and 100 years is a tremendous honor. And if some will be perhaps extended by exception, but in other words, I wouldn't want the feeling to be that if you didn't get extended, somehow you fell short. I mean, it's a tremendous honor that you get, and that there will be a few who might be extended and for a variety of reasons, but the expectation is 100 years. And that keeps it positive, I think, in every respect. And so that's the thought, Joan. And then the other thought, and we've talked about this before, is what happens to names, if you will, and those who've had things named for them after 100 years. And just the notion that there is another place for these names to reside, so that the memory of their work is retained in some other way. And I don't know what that'd be. There could be many, many different ways. I think it'd just be good to have a place where these people that we've honored, another place that they go and that we retain their memory. So as you guys draft, those are a couple thoughts which you may or may not find useful. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Regent Powell, absolutely agree on both points. And something that I think should be said overtly in this public forum is one of the upsides to incorporating this sunset provision into the broader namings policy is that after time passes, many of our current students don't even know who the person is who is being honored with the naming of the building. It happened so long before them that unless they really intentionally pursue an understanding of the historical context of the building, they don't know who the person is or what they did on behalf of the university. By having this process, when it's time for a new person to be honored, we can intentionally contextualize and re-honor the person in a new way who had their name on the building with a plaque or a designation. Some campuses have a memorial hall where all of the people who were honored previously, there's a centralized space. There are a lot of choices that we could pursue around that. And that way, in a way, it allows the name to have more vibrancy and live on longer and with a deeper understanding, which we think is a positive thing.
Thank you. Any follow-up?
No, thank you.
Regent Farnsworth.
Thank you, Chair Verhalen, and thanks President Gable for the presentation this morning. I was here in the boardroom in April 2019, not here, over there, and come a long way since then. Feels really positive to me. I think, as been mentioned, ensuring community and belonging on campus for everyone is one of the most important things we can do. So really glad that this is being presented in that framework. Also commenting on the process, particularly kind of what you mentioned around how namings or renamings will be interacting with the University Honors Committee, and then all of that seems really transparent and good process. And of course, that will be finalized, and we'll talk more about that in December. But I think I've asked you this before, but just, for the sake of this public forum and perhaps I'm clarifying this, at least for now in this point of the process, already have had a few questions from students who in particular were engaged with this work, but not just students around. Last time this was in front of the board, there were 4 very specific names of buildings that were being discussed, and kind of in the context of this new policy development, what's going to happen with those 4, and perhaps we could just, clarify that for folks that may be wondering. So thank you.
Sure. Madam Chair, Regent Farnsworth. So the previous work is historical information. I should add that part of the board's charge that isn't related to renamings, but that we have acted upon that's relevant to your question, is that there was a call for the administration to enhance our deepened understanding of our institutional history. And we have done that through a variety of events, but we've also hired an additional archivist and a professor who specializes in public institutional history, so that we would have the ability to dive even deeper into our institutional history, both in the case of the 4 administrators previously reviewed and anything else that comes up, as it might in an institution with a history as lengthy as ours. So the expectation prior to having actually drafted the detailed policy language, so this could change, by the way, in the course of the drafting of that language, is that the case would need to be made under the newly formed language for whether it's 100 years and now it's time, which would be relevant. I'd have to look at the timeline, whether that applies to any of the 4, or the case would need to be made now under the structure of the policy for whether the acts that occurred under their leadership or that are alleged to have occurred under their leadership constitute bad actor. It gives us the structure for the review, and we would have to do the review again if the 100 years is not up yet. In any case, once the 100 years is up, all of those buildings would go through review, as would all other buildings across the system.
Any follow-up?
Yeah, just thanks, Chair Verhalen, and just thank you for that answer. That was helpful. I think those 4 names in particular are kind of level setting context for a lot of people on campus with this work in general, but obviously there's a lot more happening here, and looking forward to hearing about this in our December meeting with some policy language, and especially leading up to their hearing what the fruits are of the shared governance consultation. I think us having as much information about that as possible is going to be really important. So thank you.
Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Much of the topics that I would touch on have been covered a bit. Following on, when we talk about, I appreciate the Honors Committee's work on this. I do want to make sure that the board, as the representatives of the state of Minnesota, the community, I think has a important role in this process, and so I appreciate the fact that we are engaged in this. Starting with kind of the last topic first. One of the things I'm very interested in is what the process is going to be. Having been fairly involved in reviewing the material of the 4 that Regent Farnsworth just brought up, it would certainly make sense to be taking issues on one at a time. I think that this kind of throwing 4 of them into one dialogue made it a little bit difficult, but also having a standard of the quality of the information that was provided. That it's a much longer dialogue, which we may end up having someday, but that was also a challenge in understanding what the standard is going to be, how these things are going to be addressed on a sort of case by case basis, because we're really kind of talking about namings, renamings, and unnamings at this point. And so having that unnamings concept, understood well, I think will keep us from having the circumstances that we went through a couple years ago. That being said, I'm in agreement with Regent Powell. I think that we should just approach it with the presumption of a change in namings, that the original nominee or the original honoree could be renamed or could be renominated to have the name continue. But my concern is that if the first step is to determine whether they should stay on, there's kind of a stigma of someone not meeting the standard for staying on. And so I would definitely appreciate a policy that just makes the presumption that there will be a renaming, but the person could be renominated on that same basis and then considered among other potential names. I think 100 years is too long. In response to the specific point that the president made a moment ago about the 4 names that were under consideration a while back, I think they started in the late 30s. So we're not quite at 100 years on even the first of those folks. But the issue with 100 years is my expectation is that by maybe even 50 years, or 75, if not 50, the names sort of become no different than named after, a type of tree, or it just becomes a landmark people don't really understand or have a relationship with the background information as to why a building is named a certain thing. And so looking at how long we would expect buildings to remain, what's the expected, the life expectancy of a building that's built today, that might be something that would guide us a little bit as to how long namings would presume. But I would prefer having a bit shorter than 100 years, just because it gives each new generation an opportunity to honor people either at that time or even in the recent past, and allows as new communities arise in the university environment, they will have an opportunity to put their mark on these buildings as well. I think 100 years slows that down quite a bit. So those are my comments. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness that is clear in this is being approached by the administration, and I look forward to the continuing conversation in December. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Rocha.
No, thank you.
Okay, Regent Mayron.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair Verheugen. One just clarifying question. Am I correct that the namings policy generally is up for comprehensive review? So when we look at something in December, will we be looking at a totally comprehensive review and editing of the namings policy, or will we only be looking at the renamings portion that President Gabel and her administration are focusing on? That's one question. Why don't I go with that question first, and then I'll ask make my second comment.
Mr. Steves.
Madam Chair, Regent Mayron, this policy is up for comprehensive review this year. The president is the chief policy implementer of the namings policy in totality, not just the renamings portion. But so we do anticipate that in December it will be a comprehensively reviewed policy with edits that would be related to renamings, but also related to other elements as well. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. With that in mind, my hope would be, and probably assumption, is that we would make sure that any principles that I would hope that we would identify principles for naming honorary namings, and that they would be consistent with the principles that we are articulating with respect to renaming. So, and my memory is of the namings policy, it really doesn't lay out any principles for what would constitute a basis for an honorary naming. So my hope is that they would be those two concepts would be married, would be expressed and would be consistent with each other. Second of all, I do share the view of Regent Rocha that I believe 100 years is too long. And I would certainly support something that was shorter so as to create other opportunities sooner rather than later to honor other individuals who have performed extraordinarily or been significant to the university. And so I'm interested, certainly from President Gable, as to the rationale for 100 years. I know you've looked at shorter periods of time. And so I'm interested in how you landed on the 100 years. And I'm also interested as you go through the consultative process with the community, what their reaction is and what you hear back in terms of feedback, in terms of their view on the length of time on the sunset provision.
President Gable?
Madam Chair, Regent Mayeron, frankly, the 100-year number is the most arbitrary portion of what we are proposing, in the sense that we're trying to strike a more know it when you see it feeling of substantial time. Buildings should last for a very long time. And if you have done something that is so notable that we would chisel the stone in order to have your name in it, that it should stay there for a really long time. But beyond that, how long that actually is more of a qualitative measure than a quantitative measure. And we have heard a wide range of feedback from different consultative groups, even in the informal phase that we've been in so far. It is, anecdotally, it feels like most people tend to think 100 years is too long. With all due respect to Regent Rocha, most people seem to think 50 years is too short. So probably somewhere in between. And where we set it is also a question of operation, because the campus was built in phases. And so where you set it will periodically result in large tranches of buildings going through at the same time or in a couple of years. And that's something we may want to think about from an operational point of view, because it would, for certain periods of time, it wouldn't be one at a time. We could, in the foreseeable future, have clusters of several buildings at the same time that would go through, and that would be quite disruptive. So to think about how to spread it out is part of how we came up with that number. But there's no, it's relatively arbitrary. And so if it is in the collective wisdom of the board to shorten the 100 years, we have no resistance to that at all.
Thank you.
Regent Mayeron, any further?
No, thank you very much.
Regent McMillan?
Thank you, Chair Verhalen, and excellent work here, thoughtful and quite extensive and much appreciated. I'm in the camp of 50's too short, 100 too long for what that's worth, but also appreciate the importance of staging, so you don't have 10 buildings that need to be renamed one year and 0 the next. It's going to take some thought and work, but I would support something in between for what that's worth. And again, thank you for the effort. That's all I have.
Thank you. Regent Rocha.
Yep. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I appreciate these comments. One thing that I didn't mention is that I think there may be value in also having a standard, and maybe it's something only at the outset, to have a handful of legacy buildings, as our recently renovated, Pillsbury Hall. That and also perhaps even looking at a category such as former presidents as being a perpetually named, which maybe 100 years from now a board would have to reconsider if there are that many presidents, that all the buildings are now legacy buildings. But that may also have an impact on having these clusters. We'd have to kind of look at see which ones are coming up. But I think that there would be certain categories that at least I personally would be comfortable saying that this is a standard that we can accept for the university community as being a perpetual legacy type naming. So something else to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. Any additional comments, questions, feedback? I do agree that with the sentiment that 50 years feels too short, but 100 years feels too long. And definitely will be interested to hear what additional feedback you receive in your consultative process with the university community. So thank you so much, President Gable. That then brings us to our information items. Mr. Steves, anything to highlight at this time?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, this is also just a good time to refresh you on what happens when a comprehensive review of a policy is completed and there are no changes that are being recommended. What happens is it goes in the docket in the relevant committee, so this committee or in finance and operations or mission fulfillment, and it's linked here and it's just reported back to you that the comprehensive review has been completed and we're not recommending changes at this point in time. And just as a reminder, every board policy is comprehensively reviewed once every 6 years. And so it's a fairly significant review that we do. This time, I'll just report that the board's policy on board policy development has been reviewed and we're not recommending any changes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steves. Are there any final comments? All right, seeing no hands and there being no additional business before the committee at this time, we stand adjourned. I believe we will reconvene in.
We'll reconvene at 25 past the hour for the full board session.
Thank you very much, Chair Powell. We stand adjourned.